Again, wow, they did it again. I can't believe it. I was so excited to play, but I didn't realize that it would really continue on what the first game had done. When I finished the first game, I was obsessed. It was so much fun to see all the lore and all the things that I'd missed. I was so eager to play the DLC, but I knew I had to wait for the right timing, and it finally came. Unlike the first one, I did know a little more of what to expect. I had heard that it would be scary, and so I assumed that that was going to be the biggest challenge. I wasn't sure how I was supposed to play with young kids watching. I debated with myself on it. I even asked on Reddit what people thought, and I decided, let's just give it a shot, and if it's too scary, then I'll let them drop off and I'll finish on my own. But somehow they completely subverted my expectations again. But before I get any further, again, a spoiler warning. This game is something you can really only experience once, and you should start from the beginning. I've already played and reviewed the first game, and I definitely recommend that you play it yourself before you watch anything. It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and somehow they managed to make lightning strike twice, and the DLC is just as good. When I finally started the DLC, it had been a few months since I had played, so I kind of felt rusty, and it was kind of strange to open the game and be in control again. I'd watched a lot of playthroughs and was used to just watching someone else do it. I had forgotten how deep the game feels. I did have a few spoilers going into it, not much. First of all, I knew it was scary. I knew there were some scary characters that would lurk around, and at one point, I knew they would reach out and try to grab you or something. But again, going in mostly blind was a great way to experience the game. From the little bits and pieces I had heard, I assumed that there would be some scary characters and you'd learn to overcome your fears, and in the end I assumed they would become your friends and you'd realize there had been nothing to be afraid of at all. I was wrong, but I'm glad I was. I'd like to think of the game as having 4 different phases. First would be discovering, then understanding, then following, and finally unlocking. I'll be breaking my review into those 4 parts. It's not necessarily that the game follows a linear path, a formulaic progression through each of those stages, but that each mystery has its own 4 stages to unlock the ending. And then each of those mysteries in turn become another path of those 4 stages. I can tell that Mobius Digital is full of real designers. Designers don't really look at problems the same way you would in math, where there's a formula that you need to plug in and follow the process. Design is a little more organic. In my experience, it's a little bit of divergent and convergent thinking, where at first you brainstorm with the shotgun approach, casting a wide net trying to see all the ideas, and then refine it and converge into a final focal point. That process is repeated over and over until the design's where you want it to be. There's no real finish line with design. Sometimes you just have to draw a line and say, it's good enough, we gotta move on. Personally, I admire Mobius Digital. They're great designers, they know what they're doing, and I'm all in. So first is discovering. Before I even started playing the DLC, I knew a satellite played a role, but it was still fun to start to discover the mystery that I knew would be there. My anticipation was so high. The first time approaching the eclipse was so eerie. The music was strong. Again, I had forgotten how deep the game felt, especially through the audio. I really had no idea what to expect and thought that some creature would jump out at any moment and scare me. I thought I was going to warp to some distant planetary system for a similar experience to the base game. So it was quite the surprise to land in a river and suddenly be rafting. Similar to the base game, there were signs of a sophisticated civilization, but unlike the base game, no one was there. It was empty. And that was where the real discoveries began. The ring world really works similar to the 4-level designs of the Hanging City and the Sunless City, so I immediately felt like I understood what I needed to do, which was nice. Explore each of the segments, and then put all the knowledge I'd gained together. With the time-based events, there was no going through sequentially, so you kind of just go wherever the water takes you. The physics are really impressive. I constantly was wondering, how did they do this inverted ring that also changed states, and believably, it was amazing. I know it was all custom, and I've never seen something like that before. Like the first game, they kind of throw you in the deep end, and you just gotta tread water for a bit. There are clues everywhere, and you don't even know what's important at first. You just gotta update your ship log and hope it all comes together later. The slide reels were a great addition. I loved the visual storytelling that went on there. Discovering those were like little hits of dopamine. And slowly, as you start to piece the things together, then comes the next stage, understanding. Unlike the base game where you didn't really know what the end goal was, Echoes of the Eye really made a point of highlighting the vault. It was surrounded in mystery, it felt highlighted, it was different than most of the other areas. It served as what they call a weenie in game design, something that draws your attention, like a sausage in movie production to draw a dog's attention. Outer Wilds as a whole really relies on breadcrumbs as a means of teaching you something without actually handholding you all the way through. Information is gathered in little nuggets here and there, and information is the reward that players get for exploring. Many of the secrets are accessible from the beginning of the game, but you probably won't find them unless you know what you're doing or what you're looking for. For example, I found the slide burning room on my first hour of play. It was probably intended to be found later in the game, but finding it early didn't ruin my experience. In a way, finding it early made it more exciting when I finally learned what it meant, hours and hours later. Fairly often the game uses knowledge to unlock areas. At first it felt like this game was literally going to use passwords to open doors. There were clues that passwords existed and I didn't have them. But you really only use 2 passwords. The rest have to be found another way, and it's almost a red herring that they exist. Rather than the password or knowledge being the goal, it's understanding and application that unlocks the doors. Something else I appreciate about the gameplay is affordance. As a designer, affordance is something I look at a lot. Affordance is the properties an object has to make it clear how it's to be used. For example, a game controller needs affordance to help the user understand how to hold it and where their fingers go. If a product or design has low affordance, it's hard to tell how to use it without an instruction manual or tutorial. Echoes of the Eye relies heavily on affordance to teach the user how things work. Understanding how the slide reels worked took a few steps to figure out that you needed a lantern and it fit perfectly in the slot, along with the slide reel. The light activators on the corners of the raft showed you which direction you went by pointing your lantern. In some cases, the game did flip that on its head and reversed what the affordance normally would be. Turning out the lights to open a door is the opposite of what you would expect, which is a way the game developers kept you from accessing areas too early. The game also clearly followed its own mechanics of following through on promises set up. Unlike a mystery box plot, where lots of loose ends are left dangling for you to catch, the game didn't feel random. Everything had a purpose and a meaning. Each technique or mechanic was taught up front somehow, and it's only until you understood how it worked that you could make use of it. I'm amazed at the pacing of these games. They keep everything interesting. You don't get stuck for long without something new to explore or try. The times you do get stuck are when you're trying to brute force or do something you don't fully understand. Those nuggets of understanding are sprinkled throughout the game, and it's fun to find each one. I didn't talk about this in my review of the base game, but the art direction is so good. Originally, I was thrown off a little by the cartooniness of the art, but as I got further along and in retrospect, I've noticed how intentional that design really was. They used the contrast between detail and simplicity to help direct your focus on the things that are important. I wish my portfolio looked as good as Ian Jacobson's. I could look at his work for hours. The design isn't random or even just trying to look cool. There's a reason for every design decision. There's a theme driving every choice. As a Hearthian, you have a homespun aesthetic, a frontier-style mood. The Nomai have a more ancient Grecian feel, something very sophisticated but old and mysterious. While this new species has more of a Native American influence, with its own twist. The slideshows were also an amazing addition to this game. I know they took forever to make, but each one was so exciting to find. Unfortunately, I don't know that I really connected to individual characters again. In the base game, there were a lot of names that regrettably I didn't pay attention to, so some of the character development and story arcs went a little over my head. And in this game, I don't really think I saw a difference between any of the characters. They felt a little bit of a copy and paste. I would have loved to learn a little more of their individuality, similar to the Hearthians, each having their own flavor. They were definitely creepy. The first game had some unsettling moments, but not quite the same creepy factor. The base game was pretty dark, but this game goes to pure black. It leaves some room for your imagination to go wild. I'm reminded of the director's commentary on How to Train Your Dragon when they intentionally lit some scenes darkly. All the work they put into modeling the scenes and environments were hidden in the darkness, but the small little hints of detail below the surface gave it some more depth and drew your attention to the truly important part of the scene. In this game, as your understanding deepens, you're able to go to the dark places, the places you would have avoided completely at the start. This is where you have to apply the understanding you've gained and start following. On the road to understanding the Aulk, you really have to follow in their footsteps and retrace their steps, see what they learned, and uncover what they've intentionally hidden. Sometimes that means you have to go places you don't really want to go. I seriously felt an invisible wall keeping me from going in the basement of one of the lodges. And yet I knew that room held the secrets I needed to progress. The ethereal music and sounds and the inhabitants made me almost reverence the room. I knew something special would happen here. It almost reminded me of the Mandalorian Forge. It was a hidden place that was going to teach me something as I followed in the footsteps of the people before. I knew that this is where the scary part began. It put me on edge, and that was great. They got a lot of mileage out of the fear of the simulation through the way they introduced it. Trying to follow the paths in the dark and light the candles along the way forces you to be careful and methodical. Being stripped of your tools and light is annoying, but the limitations are usually what makes a good story. The author Brandon Sanderson makes it his second law that limitations are more important than abilities. In other words, it's not as interesting to do anything you want. The adventure comes from trying to work with what you have. When you start to actually follow the Alks, there's a chance you might bump into one of them, which cranks up the tension. When I came across the first Alk watching the slideshow, I thought that was the only one and I didn't really have anything else to worry about. But seeing one walking by the party house made me realize they were mobile and I wasn't safe. Again, it felt like there was an invisible wall and I didn't want to go any farther, and I was glad I had my kids as an excuse. It was the ultimate challenge to face your fears and follow them even into the dark. That was legitimately the most terrified I've ever been playing a game ever in my life. My nerves were wrecked. I didn't sleep well that night. But even still, I was hungry for more. The reward of each of those challenges was unlocking the next stage of the mystery. From the beginning of the game, it's pretty obvious that there are literal locks you need to open. It's so rewarding when you finally have the keys to unlock everything and see what's inside. I've seen a few playthroughs where people discover secrets before they're revealed, and that's unfortunate. I feel like the first game seemed a little less likely to do that. On the other hand, I was reminded of the base game a few times at some head-banging moments. Getting through the party house made me feel like I was reliving getting to the Southern Observatory. I lost count of how many times I tried. All through the game, I was curious what the Alks' intentions were. The slide rails had shown what had happened to them, but I wasn't sure of their true motives. For a while, I thought that the simulation was trapping them and they couldn't actually die, and in a way, they were saving me from a similar fate by blowing out my lantern. I felt like that would be the twist ending that I'd get. So honestly, I was just a little disappointed that they really were just out to get me. They had their secrets and they didn't want them to be unlocked. The 3 bug reports that help you bypass the vault codes were mind-blowing when I first learned them. I've seen some players accidentally discover some of those bugs. Also, learning that the simulation had the unburned slide rails was exciting to fill in those missing pieces and unlock that information. Those powerful moments fitting into place felt right, but sad. As more information was unlocked, the only remaining thing was the final vault. I thought that it would be a culmination of all the things I had learned, a face-off with a boss battle that would overshadow anything I had experienced so far. At first, I was a little disappointed that there really wasn't a final showdown, but as I thought about it, it really fit the theme of the entire experience. Fear of the unknown really isn't a bad thing. In fact, out of that fear can come something beautiful. Having a chance to share our stories with one another really was the showdown. Look, with this review video, I'm sharing my story even now. That's what life's all about, learning and sharing and building relationships with each other. Once we've had an amazing experience, we can't help but share it with others. It reminds me of Plato's Cave, where prisoners are forced to watch shadows on the wall and try to decipher what they mean, but once some are freed and allowed to leave, they can see that it's all fake. And once they step out into the real world where the sun is and there's even more, they try to convince everyone back to the start what's really there. That seems to be what's happened with the prisoner. He's able to look beyond the fears that the others around him have of the eye. The game doesn't really tell us why he's different than the others. He has a broken antler, so maybe that's a sign that he's faced danger before and has a different perspective. The Alks are a very large race, so there's probably not much that scares them. And that's probably why the eye is so frightening. They've seen what it can do. But the prisoner, on the other hand, seems to be able to see beyond the fear. In the last vision he sends us, we sail into the sunrise. He's not afraid of the light and what that means. And that brings us to the eye. I didn't really talk about it much in my first review, mostly because I feel like each of us can see the ending differently. I do have some ideas of what it means, but I also have questions, and I think that's okay to leave it open-ended. The eye seems to be some sort of cosmic reset button that takes information from an observer to generate a whole new universe. I'm curious, what would happen if someone entered the eye when the galaxy was new? Would it restart early? If the Alks immediately went into the eye, would the rest of the story been over? Or would the eye wait for the universe to die on its own and then restart? It seems like the Alks believed that anyone entering the eye would have ended everything, so they did all that they could to block the signal and keep anything from going in. Maybe the eye isn't a reset button. Could it be a crack between universes, a gateway between one and the next? Or a universe inside another universe? Whatever the case, it's fun to think about. The fact that our friends are there to give us one last goodbye really is an endearing part of this whole game. Are they really there, or are they just part of my imagination? I tend to think that they're as real as the phases of the quantum moon. In other words, they're not just in my head, they've become actualized, just like the new universe will be. That new universe will be based on my experiences, the things that I've come to learn about each of these three races, and the contributions they make. The Nomai were driven by curiosity, identify and explain were their two strongest tenets. They had festivals to share information, they wanted to learn, they wanted to know. When they couldn't reach the eye, they had a decision, keep searching or move on, and it looks like the search won out. The Alks were similar but different. They were driven by information. They wanted to collect information, and the eye seemed to have a limitless amount. But when they saw it had bad information, their impulse was to hide it. They weren't always so afraid, but it became their defining feature. The Harthians seemed to be driven by story. They wanted to find the story behind the world around them and what the Nomai had left. They often asked, "What's the dirt?" Feldspar's adventures had turned into legend, and they created an entire museum to tell the story of what they had found. The Hatchings saw the travelers as heroes, and he even added Solanum and the prisoner to the collection. The story was stronger when everything was woven together. And unfortunately, that brings us to the end. For now, I hope. I'm so excited to see what they come up with next. I definitely still have questions. The process of designing a game must be an adventure in and of itself. I've heard interviews of directors and composers who talk about how terrified they are at the start of a project to start something new. Even with successes under their belt, there's no guarantee that what they do next will be as good. But that's the fun part about the design process. You never know what you're going to get, but it can be amazing. Whatever happens next, I don't think it's to be feared.